It started as a normal day in court. The air was thick with tension as the judge glanced down at the young man standing before her. 17-year-old Malik Carter, a bright student with a promising future, stood in handcuffs, his expression a mix of frustration and fear. He had never imagined himself in this position, accused of a crime he did not commit. But here he was, trapped in a system that saw him as guilty before he even had a chance to speak. The prosecutor smirked as he laid out his argument, painting Malik as a dangerous troublemaker. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The surveillance footage shows the suspect wearing a hoodie, matching the defendant's description. The store owner identified him. The stolen goods were found near his home. This is not a misunderstanding, this is a crime." Malik's public defender, a man clearly overworked and underpaid, barely put up a fight. "Your Honor, my client insists he was not at the scene. There are inconsistencies in the evidence that need to be considered." His words sounded weak, as if he had already accepted defeat. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a woman with a reputation for being tough on young offenders, tapped her gavel lightly. She had seen countless cases like this before. Another young black teen claiming innocence. Another case where, in her mind, the truth did not really matter. She had already made up her mind. She leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say before I make my ruling?" Malik swallowed hard. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew the truth, but he also knew how this system worked. It did not matter that he had been home studying that night. It did not matter that he had never even set foot in that store. The moment he had been arrested, he was labeled guilty. Still, he had to try. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice steady but desperate. "I did not do this. You are making a mistake." The judge exhaled, already tired of his words. "The evidence says otherwise." Tears stung Malik's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He turned his head slightly, catching his mother's gaze from the gallery. Her eyes were filled with silent fear, but also something else: determination. And then he remembered his dad. Malik's hands tightened into fists. The system might not care about his innocence, but there was one person who would make them listen. He took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "Call my father." The courtroom went silent for a moment. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Malik's mother, who had been sitting quietly, finally stood. Her voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, my son has the right to make a call." The judge hesitated, but then shrugged. "Fine. Let him have his phone call. It will not change anything." Malik took the phone, his fingers shaking slightly. As he dialed, the line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Malik?" "Dad," he said, his voice breaking just a little, "I need you." On the other end of the line, U.S. Attorney General Daniel Carter went completely still. His son was calling him from inside a courtroom, and from the tone of his voice, something was very, very wrong. The judge sighed impatiently. "I hope this is not a waste of time." But she had no idea, because in the next few moments, the entire courtroom and the entire justice system was about to face a reckoning. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a shift in tone, one Malik recognized immediately. His father, Daniel Carter, was no longer just a dad answering a call. He was the U.S. Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country. And something about that realization sent a shiver down Malik's spine. "Where are you?" his father asked, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Malik's throat felt dry. "I'm in court," he said quietly. "They're trying to say I robbed a store, but Dad, I didn't do it. He stopped himself, his voice catching. "They're not listening to me." His father's silence lasted just long. Enough for Malik to imagine the expression on his face, the one he had seen during press conferences. the one that made senators and governors straighten their backs. Then his father spoke again, and there was no doubt in Malik's mind that everything in that courtroom was about to change. "Put the judge on the phone." Malik lifted his head and met Judge Reynolds' gaze. For the first time since this nightmare started, he saw something new in her eyes: hesitation. She had assumed this case would be routine, just another young black teen she could push through the system. But now there was something she had not expected: power. "My father wants to speak with you," Malik said, holding out the phone. The judge hesitated before letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "I don't take orders from defendants," she said, "especially ones in handcuffs." But the way she said it did not carry the same confidence as before. Malik's mother, who had remained composed this entire time, took a step forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I suggest you take the call." The judge's jaw tightened, but something about the way Mrs. Carter spoke made her reconsider. She reached out, took the phone and placed it to her ear. "This is Judge Patricia Reynolds," she said flatly. Whatever she heard on the other end made her posture stiffen. Her face changed, not quite fear, but something close. She turned, slightly in her chair, her voice lowering. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this case is being handled fairly." Malik watched her closely. Her fingers twitched against the phone. "Yes, I understand," she continued, her voice tight. "However, there is substantial evidence." She stopped suddenly. The color in her face shifted. "No, sir, of course not." The prosecutor, who had been leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, was now sitting up straight. He glanced at the judge, then at Malik, and then at Malik's mother. His confidence wavered. "Understood, sir." Judge Reynolds' voice was softer now, more careful. She swallowed hard before handing the phone back to Malik. She did not meet his eyes. Malik brought the phone back to his ear. "Dad, I'm on my way," his father said. The call ended. The courtroom was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then the judge cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders. She reached for her gavel, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "We will take a brief recess," she announced. The bailiff stepped forward to escort Malik back toward the holding area. But this time, the judge's expression was different. It was no longer the look of someone who had complete control. It was the look of someone who had just realized they had made a mistake. Malik was led down a narrow hallway, his heart pounding. He did not know exactly what his father had said, but he knew enough to understand that something had shifted. He had spent the last few hours feeling powerless, but now, for the first time, he saw cracks in the walls that had seemed unbreakable. But the fight was not over yet, because if his father was coming, that meant the truth was about to come out. And the truth had a way of making people very, very nervous. Malik sat in the cold holding room, his hands still cuffed. The metal dug into his wrists, a reminder that even with his father on the way, he was still treated as guilty. The officers had not said much when they brought him here, but their glances had changed. There was a shift in the air, uncertainty. He stared at the wall, trying to stay calm. His mother's face stayed in his mind, the quiet strength in her eyes. She had always told him the world was not fair, that sometimes the truth was not enough. But she had also told him that he was not powerless, that their family was built to stand against things like this. The door opened and the public defender walked in. He looked more alert than before, as if he had just realized the weight of the case he was handling. He sat down across from Malik, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Malik," he said, voice quieter than before, "your father is on his way." Malik nodded, waiting. The lawyer sighed. "Listen, I need you to know something. The prosecutor and the judge, they thought this was just another easy conviction, a simple case. No one was expecting your father to get involved." He leaned forward. "That changes everything." Malik could already tell. the shift in tone, the way the judge had suddenly backpedaled, but he also knew something else. Powerful people did not like being challenged. "So what happens now?" Malik asked. The lawyer exhaled. "They'll stall. They'll try to find a way to justify keeping you here, at least until your father arrives. But the fact that the U.S. Attorney General is on his way—" He let out a short laugh. "That means this case isn't staying in this courtroom for long." Malik swallowed, his chest tightening. He was relieved, but something about this did not feel over. The way the prosecutor had been so sure, the way the judge had barely glanced at his defense. They had wanted this case to disappear into the system, and now they were scrambling. The door opened again, and an officer stepped inside. "Carter," he said, not meeting Malik's eyes. "You have another phone call." Malik frowned as the officer placed a landline phone in front of him. The lawyer looked just as confused, but nodded for him to take it. Malik lifted the receiver. "Hello?" A voice came through, low, controlled. Not his father. "You think this changes anything?" Malik froze, his pulse quickened. The voice belonged to the prosecutor. "I don't know what kind of favors your father is trying to pull, but let me make something clear. This case was solid before he got involved, and it's solid now." The prosecutor's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Anger, desperation. "You had your chance to go quietly, but now you've made this a spectacle." Malik tightened his grip on the phone. "I didn't do anything," he said. The prosecutor chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That doesn't matter, kid." A pause. It never mattered. The line went dead. Malik stared at the phone, his heartbeat slamming in his ears. The lawyer was already on his feet. "What was that?" Malik set the phone down slowly. "The prosecutor," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "He's scared." The lawyer nodded, his face unreadable. "Yeah," he said, "and that's dangerous." Back in the courtroom, Judge Reynolds sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded in front of her. The prosecutor stood beside her, his face pale. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. Judge Reynolds glanced at the bailiff. "Find out how soon Carter will be here," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside she was calculating. The prosecutor leaned in. "We need to end this before he arrives." The judge said nothing for a moment, then picked up her pen and tapped it against the desk. She had been a judge for a long time. She knew how to make cases disappear, but this time she was not sure if she could bury the truth fast enough. And outside, just beyond the courthouse doors, black SUVs were pulling up to the curb. The U.S. Attorney General had arrived. The air inside the courthouse was thick with tension. The moment the black SUVs pulled up outside, a shift rippled through the building. Officers whispered to each other. Clerks glanced at the doors, nervous. Energy filling the space. This was no longer just another case being pushed through the system. Malik sat in the holding room, his legs bouncing with anxious energy. His lawyer had stepped out to make a call, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His father was here. That should have been a relief. But something about the prosecutor's last words lingered in his mind. It never mattered. Those words carried a weight that made his stomach twist. The door opened again, but it was not his lawyer this time. It was a different officer, an older man with sharp eyes. He walked in, closing the door behind him. "You need to listen to me, kid," the officer said, his voice low. Malik stiffened. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been in this system long enough to know when something isn't right," the officer replied. He glanced toward the door, as if making sure no one else was listening. "That prosecutor, he's not letting this go easy. He's got too much riding on this case." Malik frowned. "Why? It's just a robbery charge." The officer shook his head. "No, it's not. It was never about the robbery. It was about getting a conviction. Any conviction." He lowered his voice. They needed a name on paper, and you were the easiest target. Malik's chest tightened. He had known this was wrong, but hearing it laid out like that made his blood run cold. They know they messed up, the officer continued, and now with your father here, they're trying to cover their tracks. Malik swallowed hard. What are they going to do? The officer hesitated. That depends. They might try to delay things, make it look like a mistake that will take time to correct, or, his voice darkened, they might double down. Before Malik could respond, the door swung open again, and his lawyer walked in, his face tight with urgency. The officer stepped back, slipping out of the room without another word. Malik turned to his lawyer. What's happening? His lawyer exhaled. They're trying to rush a plea deal. Malik blinked. What? They want you to plead guilty to a lesser charge, the lawyer explained. They're saying if you agree, you'll be released today with a reduced sentence. No jail time, just probation. He looked at Malik, his expression unreadable. But they want you to sign now, before your father gets into the courtroom. Malik's mind spun. They were desperate. This was their last attempt to make sure their version of the story stuck. If he signed, they could say it was never about race, never about corruption, just a kid making a mistake and taking responsibility. But if he refused, he clenched his fists. I'm not signing anything. His lawyer gave a small nod. Good, because your father is already inside, and he's not coming alone. The courtroom doors opened, and the tension in the room became unbearable. U.S. Attorney General Daniel Carter walked in, his presence commanding the space before he even spoke. He was flanked by 2 high-ranking federal officials and 3 attorneys. From the Department of Justice, the moment he entered, Judge Reynolds sat up straighter. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The bailiffs stood still, unsure of what came next. Daniel Carter walked forward, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was sharp when he spoke. This hearing is over. The judge blinked. Excuse me. This case is under federal review, Daniel Carter continued. My son is being released immediately. The prosecutor shot up from his chair. You can't just... Daniel turned his gaze toward him, cutting him off. I can, and I will. For the first time, the prosecutor's confidence cracked. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat. I need to review the proper... No, Daniel interrupted. His voice was steady, controlled. What you need to do is explain why this case was built on falsified evidence. He took a step forward. Why my son was detained without a proper investigation. Why this courtroom was being used to secure an easy conviction instead of seeking justice. The silence was deafening. Malik had seen his father speak in front of powerful people before, but never like this. Never with this kind of cold fury. The judge's hand twitched toward her gavel, but she hesitated. The weight in the room had shifted completely. She was no longer in control, and for the first time since this nightmare started, Malik saw the fear in her eyes. Judge Reynolds swallowed hard, gripping the gavel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The weight of the U.S. Attorney General's words settled over the room, and for the first time she realized there might not be a way out. The prosecutor beside her shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. A court clerk rushed in, his face pale, as if he had seen a ghost. He hesitated for a moment before making his way toward the bench, whispering something to the judge. Whatever he said made her stiffen. Malik's father turned slightly, watching her carefully. Something you'd like to share, Your Honor? The judge hesitated. There's been a development. Daniel Carter didn't blink. Then say it. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line before she let out a slow breath. A new witness has come forward. The entire courtroom, went still. Malik's pulse quickened. New witness, he had no idea who that could be. The robbery had been a setup, and the only people involved were those trying to convict him. The prosecutor turned sharply toward the judge, his face unreadable. It was the first time Malik saw real uncertainty in his eyes. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who stepped out. A moment later, the doors opened again and a woman walked in. She was dressed in a plain blue blouse and dark jeans, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Her face was familiar, but Malik couldn't place it right away. Then it hit him. She was the cashier from the store, the one who had been behind the counter when the so-called robbery happened. Malik sat up straighter. If she was here, that meant— The judge cleared her throat. "Miss Dawson, you have information relevant to this case." The woman hesitated, glancing around the room. Her eyes landed on Malik, and she offered a small, nervous nod before turning back to the judge. "Yes," she said. She hesitated. Again, then took a deep breath. "I lied in my statement." A sharp murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's jaw clenched, and the judge's fingers twitched. Malik's lawyer stood quickly. "Can you clarify?" The woman nodded, her voice trembling. "The police, they told me what to say." Malik's stomach dropped. Daniel Carter stepped forward. "What exactly did they tell you?" Miss Dawson swallowed. "That if I just signed the statement, everything would be fine, that the cameras were broken anyway, so no one would be able to prove anything different. They said the boy matched the description, and that it wouldn't make a difference if I changed a few details." Her voice cracked. "I didn't think it would go this far." Malik's breath came short. He had known this was a setup, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel even heavier. The judge's face was unreadable, but the prosecutor was clearly panicked. He leaned in toward her, whispering something furiously, but Daniel Carter wasn't having it. "That's enough," he said sharply. "The evidence was tampered with. The witness was coerced. And yet you still pushed forward with charges." He turned to the judge, his tone ice-cold. "Tell me, Your Honor, how do you plan to justify that?" The judge's face twitched, but before she could respond, another voice rang out. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case immediately." It was the prosecutor. His voice, once so confident and controlled, now held a hint of desperation. He knew he had lost, but Daniel wasn't satisfied. "No," he said, "this doesn't just go away. Someone is going to answer for this." Malik's hands clenched. His father wasn't just here to free him. He was here to dismantle everything that had led to this moment. And as the prosecutor's face drained of color, Malik realized something else. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger, and the people responsible were about to find out just how deep this fight was going to go.